training. What are the questions you're asking them? Like, where are we starting with them?
Yeah. So, firstly, I think the important thing to understand is that we don't actually really need a very specific goal for the vast majority of people. The initial things I'm more concerned with are more process oriented goals. Just to give some basic definitions, an outcome goal would be something that is, an objective standard that you want to hit. So, for example, I want to be able to squat 100 kilos for 10 reps would be an outcome goal. The process goals that would lead to that would be things like being able to squat competently to a satisfactory depth repeatedly at different intensities. So whether it's my 1 rep max or my 10 rep max, that I'm able to repeat that technique. So you've got your technique down, and then you've got the process goals of maybe squatting twice per week, not missing your lower body sessions, etc. Okay, so all of those process goals are eventually building up to the outcome goal. And early on in someone's training career, initially what we're concerned with are those process goals, because what I want to make sure is that someone is able to execute all the exercises, a broad range of exercises with pretty good technique that is, safe, repeatable, and appropriate for them as an individual. And once someone has that down, so they're now able to squat, they're now able to do hip hinge variations, they're able to do squat variations, they've started to develop the skill of lifting. That's when we start to focus a little bit more on maybe setting targets as to where our weight progression might be, because this is something that you can't necessarily lay out as a scheme of progression for everyone. Because what I often find myself saying to clients when they sign up is, that they actually have a lot more in them than they think. So, for example, I could have a client who is actually quite muscular already. It looks like they've been training. They've actually never done any training. And the primary barrier to them being able to squat a lot might be the fact that they just actually don't know how at all. So initially they might be squatting like 40 kilos for reps. And it's just the fact that it's so wobbly and so uncomfortable for them that they're not able to lift more. But for that individual, when I'm able to look at them and say, this is how much muscle mass you have, this is your performance and other activities, I might be saying, you could be upwards of 100 kilos or more squat within the next 6 months. That wouldn't be a realistic target for your beginner who's, really low levels of muscle mass, no exercise background, and is just really, really struggling with the load on day one. So that's one of the reasons that I'm not overly keen on having specific outcome goals early on, but rather getting those process goals in place. And that even stands for maybe those beyond the beginner stage as well, because what we often find is that we have to peel people back a bit to see where they're actually at. Because what people often say, we ask them, what's your 5 rep max bench press, for example, or what's your 5 rep max squat? And the answer you very often get is, oh, I did 180 for 5 2 years ago, but God, my technique was desperate. One of the lads was helping me. I had knee wraps at the time. So you'll often find that people who have even been training for a while, they've never really stuck to a program. Their technique is kind of varying at different weights. They'll allow their technique to get quite sloppy with heavy weights. They're always changing their exercises. So although someone may be muscular as you look at them, and they may very well be strong on certain exercises, they may still benefit from peeling back, nailing their technique across the exercises and getting consistent on a specific program. And then the progress kind of unfolds from there. But I suppose all those things that I've mentioned are very much oriented towards the, strength and muscle building side of the spectrum. And I think that's an important note, because that's not necessarily the goal for everyone either. And that's kind of what we're getting at here when we talk about goal setting, is that very often the types of programs that you end up writing as a trainer are very much dependent on what your own background is. What you'll often see is that someone who is physique focused, maybe they come from the bodybuilding side of the fitness industry, they'll write their programs in a particular way, whether it be a push-pull leg split, or you might have a specific structure where we go from compound exercises to isolation exercises, lower reps at the start, higher reps at the end. There's a general pattern that runs through most muscle building programs that you'll see replicated. And that's not necessarily what everyone requires. So if someone is coming in looking for sports performance, for example, they might need to do a 5 or 6 day weight training program. If someone's coming in looking to supplement their endurance training with some weight training, again, we're not going to be in the gym lifting weights 5 or 6 days a week. So that needs analysis is always the step one. And there's a million different details that you could discuss there with respect to needs analysis. But just understand that when we talk about training, you need to know the purpose of each element of your training, even just very broadly. What purpose is your cardio training or endurance training or cardiorespiratory training? What purpose is that serving? And then what purpose is the resistance training serving? Because for resistance training, that might be serving as the primary driver of the person's goal if someone's looking to gain muscle or strength. And therefore, a lot of time and energy needs to be allocated to that. However, if someone's using that resistance training for endurance training, we might only be doing 2 days per week. And they might be on days where you're already fatigued from running and therefore you're not necessarily the most prepared, but it's not too much of a big deal because we don't need to perform at our best every resistance training session. So there are some of the things that would initially come to mind for me that will be running through my head as soon as a new client signs up.
Yeah, and this is one of the hardest things to actually navigate, both as a coach and as an individual trying to train yourself. Like when we talk about goal setting, everyone kind of has an idea in their head of, oh, this is what goal setting is, and I'll just do it at the start. It's fine. It's easy. I know what I'm aiming towards. But if you actually try to sit down and write out what you're aiming towards, right, and actually be specific with it, it's actually incredibly hard. Right. And I don't mean like, again, like you said, Gary, we're talking about outcome goals. Like, I don't even mean necessarily like we're sitting down and being excessively specific with, oh, I want to be 100 kilos and I want to lift X weight and do Y or whatever. Right. I just mean like, what's the broad brushstrokes? What are we actually aiming towards? Like, what's your goal here? Are we trying to look at body composition? Are we trying to improve performance in a specific sport? Are we trying to improve, general everyday performance? Are we trying to improve health? Whatever it is, right? Like, what's the broad brushstrokes? What are we actually aiming towards, right? And everyone should have a very, okay idea of what they're aiming towards. One of the things that you will see, however, is that people kind of fall in with crowds, right? People get into resistance training, for example, purely because it's the it thing to do on like social media. People are like, oh, go to the gym, and your friend is like, oh, I want to get into some sort of exercise modality, and maybe they have a job that doesn't allow them to do a sport. Like maybe they played basketball when they were younger, and then they got a 9 to 5, and they couldn't play basketball, but they still want to be active. So they're like, oh, well, I can go to the gym at any time around my schedule, blah, 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 right? Like, we actually have to even question that. Like, if the goal is actually to play basketball, like, we could come up with some sort of strategies to allow you to play basketball, right? It doesn't have to be resistance training. So when we're talking about the fundamentals, it might even be a case of like, we're actually never doing resistance training, or we're never doing cardiovascular training or whatever. We've actually taken a step back and we've actually analyzed your goals, and we realize, maybe, yeah, resistance training or cardiovascular training or whatever would enhance these other goals, but your actual goal, the thing that you actually care about, is playing sport, or it is health or whatever. And this is really important to know, because it can be very easy to lose sight of your goals, and especially in this modern age where we all have this kind of paradox of choice going on, where everyone wants to have, oh, I want to be a world-class runner, and I want to be able to lift super heavy weights, but I also want to look really aesthetically pleasing, and I want to do jiu-jitsu as well, and I also want to occasionally travel around the world, so I'm not going to have a consistent set schedule. And basically, people have all of these asterisk goals, and while, yeah, for sure, some people can do all of that stuff, usually those people are on drugs, or they're just extreme outliers as is, right? So we have to, first of all, set our goals and then be realistic with those goals, right? And again, it doesn't have to be this, oh, my goal is going to be to lift 100 kilos or whatever, like these kind of outcome book goals. We just have to know what we're actually aiming at, right? And this actually does take a little bit of time and a little bit of reflection, because you might realize that you've been working away at a goal that you actually do not give a single fuck about, right? Like you might be like, well, actually, I've just been, resistance training for the last 5 years because that's what everyone does. When in reality, you hate resistance training. You actually want to get better at running. And then you're just going to resistance training because, it's what you used to do. It's what you did when you were, I don't know, in college or whatever. So you know how to program it, you know how to do, the lifts or whatever. And if you were to go into like running, you're kind of like, I don't really know how to program that stuff. I don't know what to do, right? So we actually have to be incredibly clear on our goals. Like I remember talking to someone before when I used to work in a gym, and every day they'd be like, oh, I'm going to the gym, working out, and chatting to them, they'd be like, oh, my goal is to do MMA, right? And I'm like, okay, well, do you do MMA at all? Like, and they didn't want to be like a pro or anything. They just wanted to, recreationally do MMA, and fair enough, right? And I was like, oh, are you doing any MMA? And they're like, oh, no, I need to get to a certain weight first, right? Or I need to get to a certain level of fitness first. And I'm looking at them going, and I was said it to them repeatedly. I'm like, just go to a class, like, why are you spending all this time trying to gain muscle so that you're in a different weight class when you've never even practiced your sport, right? You've never even practiced the sport that you actually wanted. And this is because while they had good intentions with their goals, they were like, oh, I want to be, whatever it was, 85 kilos, we'll say, for example. And they're like, oh, I want to be bigger. I want to be fitter, whatever, right? All admirable goals, great, fantastic. And obviously it fit with their schedule. It wasn't their actual goal, right? And obviously I haven't seen them in years. Who knows if they ever got into the MMA, but it is a case of that person wasn't being true to their goal, right? They weren't actually doing ultimately what they wanted to do. And again, that's perfectly fine for periods of your life or whatever. But if you leave it like that, you're always going to be thinking back going, oh, I should have gone to a class, or I should have just gone to an MMA class, or I should have done whatever, right? And we don't want that to happen. So the only way we can prevent that in 5, 10, 15 years or whatever it is if we actually sit down and plan out our goals. We actually go, okay, what am I actually aiming towards? Like, and one of the experiments or thought processes you can do to kind of help with this is to be like, right, I actually am going to try to imagine my life in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, right? Everyone is terrible at this. This is not something that you're going to be like, oh, I got this exactly right. That's not the point. The point is, like, what are you actually aiming towards? What would you be happy to look back on the last 5 years and go, oh, I've accomplished X, Y, Z, right? For example, Gary might look back or look to the future and go, where would I like to be in 5 years' time? Oh, I'd like to have 2 kids by then. I'd like to be married. I'd like to, at least be like a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, right? I'd like to, I don't know, maybe be 5 kilos of muscle bigger, or whatever it is, right? And he's like, these 20 kilos for Gary, right?
Some are pretty realistic, but that
you know what I mean? Like he's going, okay, this is the broad brushstrokes. So he's not going like, oh, I'm going to be 4.78 kilos heavier and I'll be happy with exactly that. No, he's going like, this is roughly what I would like to accomplish over in the next 5 years. And I would feel very accomplished, right? And that's what you need to do. You need to sit down and do that because the time is going to pass regardless of if you actually execute on your goals, right? So you better off spending some time now. It's painful. Like I've had people, and I usually do this, the first 4 weeks of a program with someone. I'm like, right, here's a goal setting sheet. Just have a crack at it and we'll see what comes up. And most people, they really, really struggle with that because most people don't plan ahead. Yeah, okay, in your head, you have enough rough idea of like, oh, I'd like to be making, a couple extra bucks per month, or, I'd like to be able to afford a bigger house or whatever, right? But there's no actual, like, this is roughly what we're aiming towards. It doesn't have to be hyper specific. It doesn't have to be like, I'm going to earn 100K per year or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be anything like that. We're just sitting there going, what are we actually aiming towards? And then we kind of step back and go, what's the priority list? Like, how do we rank these? For example, again, going through Gary's goal, he might be like, oh, well, actually, I want to gain 5 kilos of muscle. That would be fantastic. You know what? I could actually do that in a year, right? I can just go on some steroids and I'm fucking jacked, right? But then in his priority list, he go, okay, well, that actually is going to interfere with my ability to have children, potentially, right? So for him, the priority list might shift and he might go, you know what? That's actually a lower priority for me. I would actually be happy not getting 5 kilos of extra muscle as long as I was still able to have the 2, 3, 4, 12 kids or whatever it is in the next 5 years, So we have to be able to step back and look at that and prioritize, because like you can sit there and go, oh yeah, I have 400 goals, right? If you have 400 goals, you have no goals because you're aiming everywhere. Like I'm talking top 5 max, it's like you have 5 goals. That's it, right? And we've ranked them in priority. So we can go, oh, this is the biggest priority. If, there's an issue with this or we're spending more time on this, it's taking away from this other higher priority. So we have to, change something. So this is what I'm talking about with goal setting. Most people just never do this because it's hard. Like think of how many people you talk to and go, okay, well, what are your goals? Tell me like where you want to be in 5 years time. And people are like, you're like, this is, what are you aiming towards? You have to have some sort of aim in life. And like, well, obviously we're talking about training here, like it does help with all areas of your life, right? Take a step back and go, what am I aiming towards? If I was to continue doing the the daily processes that I'm currently doing, where am I likely to be in 5 years time, right? And if those daily processes do not align with getting you to the position that you ultimately want to be, something needs to change with those daily processes, right? Excuse me. And that goes back to discussing the fact that this is really hard to do, right? Because the more important things are the process goals, right? Because that's what you're going to do to actually achieve the goal. However, even with that, you still need to know where you are going, right? Like from a generic standpoint, like if someone has to come to us, there's a couple of things that we're looking to achieve over, a 90-day block. We want to have someone that knows how to, execute the training, right? Whether it's resistance training, whether it's running, whether it's whatever, maybe they need to learn how to execute the exercises. Maybe they need to learn how to, I don't know, use RPE or reps in reserve, or they need to know what intensity level they should be working at with the exercises, whatever. They actually need to know the implementation of training, right? Then another thing on top of that is they need to know roughly, and then we're talking broad strokes here, how to modify that training based on how they feel or what the week is going like for them. Maybe really stressful week, sleep was poor, whatever. So they need to know that. But then on a bigger or a more zoomed out scale, they need to know roughly how to design their training program, right? So it's like, those are the kind of two things we're looking at. The training side of things is like, do you actually know how to train, right? Whatever, regardless of the modalities you're using, resistance training, cardio, blah, 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 right? And then do you know how to effectively program that so that you can modify it based on your goals, right? And it's the same kind of thing with the nutrition. It's like, do we actually know how to eat on a day-to-day basis? Like, do you know how to get a protein source? Do you know what like carbs are? The actual implementation stuff, right? And then we need to know how to, effectively program that. It's like, oh, how do we diet? How do we lose weight? How do we maintain? How do we gain? Like all of those different skills, we'll call it nutritional programming or periodization, whatever you want to call it. We want to teach you that, right? That's very generic. They're somewhat like, they're outcome goals in terms of like there's 4 outcomes we want to achieve there, but they're more so like processes. It's like, okay, well, we want to, execute training. We want to be able to do it. We want to know how to, program around that. And then we also want to do the same with the diet, right? And we could just go, okay, well, everyone needs to know that. That's a kind of a higher level or a meta level, goal. It's like you need to know what to do, and that's one of the things that we do with our coaching practice or our coaching service. Like we're kind of teaching that. However, in doing that, we have to make that specific to you, right? It's irrelevant if you know how to program resistance training if you never intend to do resistance training. You're like, no, actually, that's not my goal. I could not care less about that, right? It's relevant then. So we need to know how to actually execute. I don't know, maybe you want to go swimming or something. It's like, do you actually know? Are you working with a coach that's teaching you how to swim? Are you actually in the pool? Are you getting better at the execution of actually swimming, right? And do you know how to program that and then support that nutritionally, etc., right? So we have to have that goal. Like we have to have that aim, that overall or overarching guiding, like this is what we're aiming towards, and these are all the process goals or all the little tiny outcome goals that we want in aiming towards that. And again, as I said, this is incredibly hard to do.
Yes, it is.
Fantastic, Gary. Do you have anything else to say on goal setting? Because like we could literally sit here all day and talk about
goals. I mean, that's it's almost a podcast in itself, really, the goal setting side of things. Not necessarily what we want to cover in all of this podcast, but there are some more things that are tangential to goal setting that are important here. And that would be, I guess, having a basic understanding of why we would do resistance training and why we would do cardio training.